She smirked across the table as if she'd been waiting for her cue. One of her friends had asked me to retell a story an old hiking trip where I'd lost track of the trail. I got 2 sentences in before she cut me off, leaning in with a brightness that was sharp, not warm. "Oh, don't let him fool you," she said, her voice carrying just enough to pull everyone's attention. "He got lost 3 times that weekend. He's like a human compass, but spinning the wrong way." The laughter came quick, practiced. Even I smiled, but inside I felt the sting. I knew that story. It had always been one of those private things we'd laugh about together, her hand squeezing mine, a shared joke. Now it was a performance. A new audience, same script, except this time I wasn't part of it. I was the punchline. I felt my fingers press against the silver fountain pen in my pocket, the one she'd given me on our 3rd anniversary. I used to carry it out of sentiment, telling myself it reminded me of her faith in me, her belief in what I wrote. But in that moment, I gripped it like a tether. Something about the weight of it steadied me, even as her eyes flicked toward me with their victorious curve of lips, half playful, half dismissive. I didn't speak. The table moved on to other jokes, other stories, but my ears rang with the echo of hers. My silence wasn't noticed. They were too busy laughing, nodding, raising glasses. She leaned back in her chair, satisfied, her hand tracing the rim of her wine glass. Not once did she look at me to see if I'd laugh with them. It wasn't about me. It was about what the story brought her: charm, attention, an easy spotlight. I replayed her expression in my head even as I forced another smile, careful not to break rhythm. That smirk wasn't the kind you offer when you love someone and tease them lightly. It was the kind you give when you know you've cut deeper than you should but disguised it as play. That's when it landed. This wasn't an accident. She knew exactly what she was doing. The rest of the dinner blurred. I heard fragments of conversation, caught flashes of her hand brushing someone's shoulder as she laughed, saw her tilt her head just enough to hold attention. I responded when spoken to, but my focus kept dropping back to the pen. Cold metal under my fingers, a reminder that I didn't mishear, didn't misinterpret. Something had shifted. When dessert came, I excused myself under the pretense of taking a call. Outside, the air was cooler than I expected, and I let the silence stretch. My reflection in the restaurant's dark window stared back at me, jaw tight, eyes tired. I turned the pen over in my hand, remembering how she'd once said, "This is so you," something elegant, precise. Back then it felt like a declaration. Tonight it felt like irony. I stayed outside longer than necessary, waiting for my chest to settle, waiting for the mask to feel natural again. When I finally walked back in, she glanced at me quickly, then turned her attention elsewhere. No question, no concern. Just a flick of her eyes, then back to the room. And that, more than the joke, told me what I needed to know. I sat back down, nodded when someone asked if everything was fine, and let the rest of the evening play out. But inside, the calculation had already begun. I wasn't furious, not yet. It was something colder, quieter recognition. The kind that tells you the ground you've been standing on isn't as solid as you believed. By the time we said goodnight and left the restaurant, I'd stopped hearing her laughter as background noise. It was strategy now. Performance. And I carried that silver pen like proof that the show had already started, with me written in as the fool. The changes didn't arrive overnight. They crept in like drafts through a window you didn't realize was cracked. At first, it was just her rushing out the door earlier than usual, claiming she had back-to-back planning sessions. She tossed the words over her shoulder, half distracted, like details didn't matter. Then came the late returns, 10, 11, sometimes past midnight. She'd slide her heels off at the door, whisper a quick apology, and vanish down the hall before I could ask anything that required more than a single sentence answer. I started paying attention not with accusations, but with quiet observation. The calendar on the fridge was full of scribbles in her handwriting. Meetings with names I didn't recognize, acronyms that sounded official but generic. One Tuesday, she said she'd be at a networking dinner across town. That same evening, a mutual friend mentioned casually she'd seen her car parked outside a cafe just blocks from our house. When I asked how the dinner went, she nodded briskly and said, "Fine, productive." No details, no follow-up. Just closure before the conversation even began. The silver pen appeared again that week. I found it on the kitchen counter, angled like she'd set it down absent-mindedly before leaving. I hadn't used it in months. She was the one carrying it now, though she never mentioned it. Something about that unsettled me. That pen had once been my symbol, my tool. Now it felt like it had been reassigned without my permission, quietly woven into whatever world she was inhabiting beyond my line of sight. I told myself I was being paranoid. Everyone's schedule shifts, work demands pile up. But the more I watched, the more it felt rehearsed. When I asked simple questions, what time did you get back, or who was that, she'd blink a fraction too long before answering, as if sorting through versions of the truth. The details never quite aligned. She'd say she was with Amanda one night, then later mention Beck in the same context. When I pointed out the inconsistency, she laughed lightly and said I must have misheard. It wasn't just me noticing. At a gathering, one of my friends teased her gently about always being on the move. She responded with an exaggerated eye roll, brushing it off with a joke about me being clingy with my questions. Everyone laughed, but his eyes met mine afterward, and I caught something in the look of hesitation, maybe guilt. Like he knew more than he could say. I carried the pen with me again the next day, almost without realizing. It tapped softly against my leg as I drove, a rhythm I didn't control. I thought about the time she used to text me midday just to share a thought, a photo, a line she'd heard. That had stopped months ago. Now the only notifications I saw from her were logistics, groceries, bills, schedules. Practical, stripped of warmth. I didn't confront her. Not yet. Instead, I locked the changes silently, the new route she drove, the unfamiliar perfumes that clung to her clothes, the way she adjusted her phone screen downward when I walked past. They were small things, individually defensible. But patterns reveal themselves when you stop giving people the benefit of blind trust. The suspicion didn't make me frantic. It made me still. I began studying her like I would a riddle, noticing the pauses between her words, the way her laughter grew sharper when she told stories that didn't include me. Every detail became part of an equation I hadn't solved yet. And at the center of it all sat that pen. Once a gift, now a marker of distance. Every time I saw it out of place, I knew I wasn't the only one using it anymore. First up wasn't loud, it was a pause that lasted one beat too long. I came home early and found her at the kitchen island, phone angled low, forearm shading the screen. "Hold on," she said, voice brighter than necessary, then ended the call with careful quiet, then set the phone face down, edge aligned with the tile. When I asked what it was, she moved a clean towel an inch and said, "Just rescheduling." A faint flush rose, then vanished. Her eyes flipped to the silver fountain pen on the counter, mine somehow migrated there, then back to me. Nothing dramatic followed. Just small changes that stacked. A new passcode after years of none at work policy. Location sharing off of batteries acting up. A tea receipt from a cafe she used to dislike. Each detail came with an easy explanation that fit if I didn't check the time beside it. I started watching the seams instead of the surface. On a short drive she told me about a colleague's presentation that nearly fell apart until she stepped in. Names, jokes, timing. A few days later at brunch she retold it, only this time a different colleague carried the day and the date moved by a week. Her face didn't change. She stirred her coffee, eyes on the swirl, and said, "It was hectic, I forget." Back home, I laid the pen on my desk and tapped the barrel once for every mismatch. Tap cafe receipt. Tap passcode. Tap presentation, version B. It was childish, but the rhythm made the air honest. I wasn't looking for a single gotcha. I was counting the weight of small things. Another evening I walked in as she stood by the window with the phone lifted toward the streetlights. When she noticed me, she turned the screen toward the curtain and said, "You're early," like I'd missed a cue. I asked if she wanted tea. She nodded, raised the phone to her ear again, but the glass was dark. She accepted the mug with both hands and thanked me without meeting my eyes. In public, her laughter changed larger when I wasn't part of the thread, than when I was. A friend asked where she'd be tomorrow. She listed places that made sense, then added one extra stop and glanced at me to see if I'd caught it. I smiled and asked nothing. I began a ledger in a small notebook, dates and lean notes in the pen steady ink. 7:40 muted call ends when I enter. 9:15 says Jim, car out shows engine off. 12:30 story retooled with new timeline. When she glanced over and asked what I was scribbling, I said it was a task list. She nodded, relieved to be believed, and gave my shoulder a passing touch that barely landed. The smallest moment set the pattern in focus. We were on the couch watching something forgettable when her screen lit the room. She tilted it toward her knee, thumb hovering. A name flashed, no heart, no star, just the first name I knew from her college stories, the kind people mention with a practiced shrug. She let the notification fade, stretched, and said she was exhausted. I believed the fatigue. I didn't believe the stretch. I didn't accuse her that night. I went to my desk, uncapped the pen, and held it above the paper until a dot bloomed. Then I wrote one word beside it in a tight hand pattern. I closed the notebook and slid it under the tray. The aim wasn't to corner her. It was to stop letting my hope explain her answers. The confirmation didn't come from her lips. It came from the careful way my friend avoided eye contact before finally pulling me aside. We were at a gathering, music low, glasses clinking, the same easy circles of laughter she loved to command. I was standing near the hallway when he stepped close, voice lowered. "She's not where she says she is," he told me. He didn't dress it up, didn't feed me rumors. Just a flat observation heavy enough to stop my breathing for a second. I didn't answer right away. My hand slid into my pocket, pressing against the silver pen. It had become a nervous habit now, the cold barrel grounding me whenever her story shifted. I turned it once between my fingers while he explained. He'd seen her, more than once, a cafe far from the meeting she'd described. Not rushing through, not hiding, sitting, waiting, laughing with someone he didn't recognize. The way he spoke told me it wasn't speculation. It was certainty. I nodded slowly, as if he'd just given me an address rather than a truth I'd been circling for weeks. "Thanks," I said, nothing more. He studied me for a second, probably deciding if he should add more, but I walked away before he could. I didn't want extra details. I already felt the room tilting. Back inside, she was at the center of a group telling some bright story about a last-minute project that almost fell apart without her. Her hands moved wide, her smile perfectly timed, the audience leaning in as if she were the spark in the room. I watched the way her fingers brushed her necklace when she laughed at something she always did when she needed to pause to buy time between one line and the next. I had thought it endearing once. Now I saw it as stage direction. I held the pen beneath the table, my thumb tracing the clip. It wasn't just a reminder anymore, it was proof that I'd been carrying her narrative for years. That night, when she walked past me with that casual confidence, I noticed the faint scent of coffee beans clinging to her jacket. She said earlier she came straight from work. Our kitchen held no beans, no grinder. The scent wasn't from here. When she finally sat beside me, she leaned close, her breath warm on my ear. "You're quiet tonight," she murmured, almost playful. I looked at her, then at the half-empty glass in her hand, and gave the smallest smile I could manage. "Just tired," I said. She nodded, satisfied, and turned away. Inside, though, something had shifted. Suspicion was no longer an internal game, a private tally of inconsistencies. Now it had witnesses. Someone else had seen what I was seeing, and they hadn't laughed it off. The quiet ledger I kept in the margins of my notebook no longer felt paranoid, it felt validated. That night at home, while she brushed her hair at the vanity, I placed the pen on the dresser and watched her reflection. She met my eyes in the mirror for half a second before looking back down at her brush. "You're staring," she said lightly. I smiled and picked up the pen again, rolling it once across my knuckles. "Just thinking," I told her. She didn't ask what about, and that omission told me everything. What broke me wasn't her evasions, it was realizing others had already pieced together what I was only beginning to face. The quiet nods, the answers that shifted away when I walked into a room, they all carried weight I hadn't wanted to name. At a family dinner, her cousin made a passing remark, something about how it must be hard, her always being out so late. The table went silent after that, forks pausing in midair. She laughed quickly, filled the space with a story about work deadlines. But the silence told me everything. They knew. I excused myself under the guise of taking a call and stepped outside. The night air was still, but inside my head the noise was deafening. I pulled a silver fountain pen from my pocket, turning it over in my hand. The ink had long since dried, I hadn't used it in months. Yet I couldn't throw it away. It was the one thing tethering me to what I thought we had, now reduced to a hollow keepsake. Each time I looked at it, I felt less like its owner and more like its custodian, preserving a relic of someone else's loyalty. Back inside, the conversations had shifted, laughter louder than before, as though everyone was relieved the subject had moved on. She glanced at me when I sat down, her smile a touch too bright, her hand resting on my arm with a practiced ease. I played along, nodded when expected, but the image of those pulse forks stayed with me. They hadn't looked surprised. They had looked caught. Later that week, I stopped by a friend's place. He offered me a beer, but his eyes avoided mine, his words careful. When I asked casually if he'd heard from her lately, just a test, he hesitated before saying, "She's busy, right, always on the go." The tone wasn't neutral, it was padded, the kind you use when you're withholding something. I let the silence stretch, watched him shift uncomfortably, then changed the subject. But the damage was done. If my suspicions had been a private storm before, now I knew the clouds had already rolled across other horizons. At home, I placed the pen on my desk and stared at it for a long time. It no longer felt like a symbol of her faith in me. It felt like a prop in a story I hadn't been invited to write. Every time she left with vague explanations, I wondered if those around her knew where she really was. And every time someone hesitated when I asked a simple question, I knew they'd already decided silence was easier than truth. What unsettled me most wasn't her deception, it was the complicity. Friends who smiled at her jokes. Family who asked no questions. They had watched me orbit her version of reality and said nothing. That kind of quiet doesn't happen by accident. It's chosen. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't rage. Instead, I started keeping the pen in a drawer instead of my pocket. Not because it lost its meaning, but because every time I touched it, I felt like I was clinging to an illusion everyone else had already abandoned. That was when the stakes became clear. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about me, the last one standing in a room where everyone else already knew the ending. The truth didn't arrive with fireworks. It slipped in sideways, almost casual, as if it had been waiting for me to finally connect the pieces. I heard his name first in a half-whisper, an old acquaintance mentioning she'd caught up with him recently, that he'd been around more than people expected. My stomach tightened. I knew the name. He was the one she used to dismiss with a laugh when we were younger. Immature, unreliable, not someone you build with. I hadn't thought of him in years, but apparently she had. That evening I asked her, gently, if she'd heard from him. Her reaction wasn't explosive, it was too careful. She blinked once, then said, "Oh, him, not really, just ran into him once." Her tone was light, but her hand fidgeted with the bracelet on her wrist. I've watched her tell enough stories to know when she was improvising. The silver pen returned the nights in a way that jolted me. I found it in her purse while searching for my charger. At first, I thought maybe she tucked it there absent-mindedly. But then I remembered, years ago she told me she once lent it to him during college when they were studying together. I hadn't thought twice about it then, it was just a passing detail. But seeing it now, in her bag after the name resurfaced, it stopped me cold. The pen wasn't just mine anymore. It was a thread running back through years, connecting her to him. I didn't confront her immediately. Instead, I let silence do the work. I watched how her story shifted. She spoke about new projects, about being mentored, words that sounded professional but rang hollow. And when she thought I wasn't listening, I caught her scrolling through old photos on her phone, her thumb hovering over one too long before she flicked past. The final confirmation came from my friend, the same one who'd first pulled me aside. We sat in his car after a late-night drive. He didn't dance around it. "It's him," he said simply. Oh, I saw them. More than once. He didn't need to add details. The way he said it told me enough. Hearing the name tied to her in the present, not just the past, cracked something open in me. It wasn't random, it wasn't sudden, it was a loop, a door she had chosen to reopen. And that pen, resting in her bag, wasn't an accident. It was an anchor, maybe even a trophy, binding the past she told me she'd outgrown with the present she thought I wouldn't notice. When I got home that night, she was asleep. I stood by the dresser, holding the pen in my hand, the weight of it almost mocking. Once it symbolized faith. Then it became a marker of suspicion. Now it was proof, a quiet relic linking me to a story that had started long before I realized I was part of it. I didn't sleep much. Instead, I sat in the living room, the pen bounced across my fingers, and thought about how betrayal rarely arrives new. More often, it's an old echo, rehearsed until it finds its way back. I waited for the right night, not out of strategy, but because I needed the stillness. She came home later than usual, the sound of her keys soft in the lock, her heels clicking lightly across the floor. She set her bag down by the door, loosened her coat, and offered a tired smile, the kind you give when you know you've been absent but don't want to explain. I didn't move from the table. The silver fountain pen rested between us, centered on the wood like a marker for what this conversation really was. She noticed it immediately. Her eyes lingered on it for half a second, then shifted to me. "You were up late," she said, voice gentle, as if she could steer us into small talk. I didn't answer her question. I just gestured toward the chair across from me. She hesitated, then sat, her movements too careful. I placed one hand on the table, flat, steady. "How long?" The words were quiet, not edged with anger, but there was no room for misunderstanding. Her face flickered just for a moment. She opened her mouth, then closed it, her gaze darting to the pen. "What are you talking about?" she asked, the tone hoarse, like she'd used it before in other conversations, maybe even with herself. I didn't lean forward, didn't raise my voice. You know what I'm talking about. My hand brushed the pen once, deliberately, before letting it go. Silence stretched, and in that silence her composure began to thin. She tried again, lighter this time, almost a laugh. You've been imagining things, stress kinda. I cut her off, not with volume but with stillness. Don't. The word was firm but calm, and it stopped her. She blinked, lips parting, then pressed them together again. She tried another angle, saying she'd been overwhelmed, that work had bled into late nights, that she'd lost track of details. But every sentence chipped over itself. I didn't argue. I didn't correct. I just sat there, my silence weighing heavier than anything I could have shouted. Her hands began to fidget, fingers picking at the sleeve of her coat, her eyes flecking to the door as though escape might appear if she stalled long enough. Finally she sat back in her chair, exhaling hard. It wasn't supposed to, she began, and stopped, biting the inside of her cheek. Her voice faltered, not because I demanded it, but because she knew I no longer believed the script. The truth, in detail, didn't matter anymore. I already had enough. My question how long wasn't about a number. It was about acknowledgement. And when she couldn't meet it, when she stumbled over words that had once come easily, I knew what I needed to know. I stood, sliding the pen back into my pocket. Her eyes followed it, almost pleading, though she said nothing. I'm done, I told her softly, not as a threat, not as drama, but as fact. She reached for my arm, but I stepped back, her fingers grasping air. The house was quiet except for her shallow breathing. She finally whispered, "We can work this out." But her voice cracked on the last word, and even she didn't sound convinced. I left her there at the table, the glass still half full beside her, her reflection caught in the window like a stranger I no longer recognized. I didn't leave in a storm. I left with precision. Bank account separated, subscriptions cancelled, access revoked. Each step was methodical, a quiet dismantling of a life we once shared. She tried to stage conversations in the kitchen, hovering near me with a soft tone, but I didn't give her an audience. Silence was sharper than argument. By the time she realized I was serious, the process was already done. Friends who had once joined in her laughter began to distance themselves. The same people who clapped at her jokes now avoided her calls. She had built her charm on shared smiles and lightness, but when the mask slipped, so did the audience. Whispers followed her where she went, and the invitations stopped. She smirked less, but when she did, it looked like muscle memory rather than confidence. The silver fountain pen stayed with me. Not as a keepsake, not as something sentimental, just as a marker. It reminded me how easily stories shift, how symbols can be repurposed until their original meanings are unrecognizable. I left it on my desk, inkless and untouched. Sometimes I glanced at it, not with longing, but with the clarity of someone who had seen a trick from the other side. She reached out eventually. Messages grew longer, calls more frequent, each one carrying the weight of desperation. At first she asked to talk. Then she asked for understanding. Finally she begged. "We can fix this," she said one night, her voice raw through the phone. I didn't respond. Not anger, not closure, just silence. It was the only language left between us. Her unraveling wasn't dramatic. It was steady. She moved through circles where people no longer trusted her words. Work slowed. The social invitations dried up. And with every attempt she made to draw me back into her orbit, I stayed still. That stillness was louder than any confrontation could ever be. When she finally saw me in passing months later, her eyes searched mine for recognition, for some trace of the man who used to play along with her stories. I gave her nothing. No nod, no smile. Just quiet acknowledgement before walking past. She had built a stage, filled it with light, and written me as the fool. But when I stopped clapping, the stage went dark, and she was left alone with the silence she once used against me.